Have you ever wondered what drives a person to commit the unthinkable against their own blood, to murder innocent children, to slaughter an entire royal lineage, all in the ruthless pursuit of absolute power? Today, we're diving into one of the most chilling and horrifying stories in biblical history. A tale so dark, it will leave you questioning the very depths of human evil. This is the story of Queen Athaliah, a woman whose name has become synonymous with betrayal, bloodshed, and the darkest royal coup ever recorded. When her son, King Ahaziah, died, instead of mourning like any normal mother would, she did something so twisted, so unimaginably cruel, that it shook the very foundations of the kingdom of Judah. She ordered the systematic execution of every single member of the royal family, including her own grandchildren. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Hidden within this massacre, protected by divine intervention and human courage, was one small child whose survival would change the course of history forever. This isn't just a story about political ambition gone wrong. This is a story about good versus evil, about how darkness can consume even those closest to the throne of David, and about how God's promises can survive even the most determined attempts to destroy them. If you're ready to uncover the shocking truth behind Queen Athaliah's bloodbath, the darkest royal coup in biblical history, then stay with me. Comment 777 if you're prepared to witness how far someone will go for power. And don't forget to subscribe, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about royal succession in ancient Israel. Trust me, this journey into darkness has twists that will leave you absolutely stunned. The seeds of Athaliah's evil were planted long before she ever set foot in Jerusalem. To understand the magnitude of her wickedness, we have to travel back to the northern kingdom of Israel, to the palace of King Ahab and his infamous wife Jezebel. This wasn't just any royal family. This was a dynasty steeped in idolatry, manipulation, and murder. Jezebel, whose name alone sends chills down the spine of anyone familiar with biblical history, was a Sidonian princess who brought with her the worship of Baal, a pagan god that demanded child sacrifice and sexual immorality. Under her influence, King Ahab abandoned the worship of the true God and led Israel into spiritual darkness deeper than anything they had ever experienced before. The prophets of the Lord were hunted down and killed. Altars to foreign gods were erected throughout the land, and the covenant that bound Israel to their Creator was trampled underfoot. But Jezebel's corruption didn't stop with her husband. She had children, and among them was a daughter named Athaliah. Can you imagine growing up in such a household? From her earliest days, Athaliah was immersed in a culture of violence, deception, and godlessness. She learned that power was everything, that human life was disposable, and that the ends always justified the means, no matter how brutal those means might be. When Athaliah came of age, a political marriage was arranged that would have consequences no one could have foreseen. King Jehoshaphat of Judah, despite being a godly man who sought to follow the Lord, made a decision that would haunt his lineage for generations. In an attempt to forge an alliance between the northern and southern kingdoms, he agreed to marry his son Jehoram to Athaliah, the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. This wasn't just a marriage between two young people. This was the injection of Jezebel's poisonous influence directly into the royal bloodline of David. The very lineage through which the Messiah would one day come was about to be contaminated by the most wicked family in Israel's history. It was like mixing pure water with deadly poison, and the effects would be catastrophic. The moment Athaliah entered the palace in Jerusalem, everything began to change. Jehoram, who had been raised to know and fear the Lord, slowly began to drift away from his father's godly example. The woman he had married whispered in his ear, just as her mother had whispered to Ahab. She brought with her the worship practices of Baal, the ruthless political tactics of her family, and most dangerously of all, the belief that bloodshed was an acceptable tool for maintaining power. When Jehoshaphat died and Jehoram ascended to the throne of Judah, The transformation was swift and brutal. One of his first acts as king was to murder his own brothers, the sons of Jehoshaphat, along with several princes of Israel. These weren't enemies or rebels. These were his own flesh and blood, potential rivals for the throne who posed no immediate threat. But Athaliah had taught him well. In her worldview, anyone who might challenge your authority deserved to die, regardless of family bonds or moral considerations. Can you see how the corruption was spreading? Like a cancer that starts small and then metastasizes throughout the entire body, Jezebel's evil influence was now flowing through the veins of Judah's royal family. The kingdom that had been established to preserve the worship of the true God, the nation through which all the families of the earth were to be blessed, was being systematically destroyed from within. Jehoram's reign was marked by disaster after disaster. The Edomites revolted and broke free from Judah's control. The Philistines and Arabs invaded the kingdom, carrying away treasures from the royal palace and even capturing members of the king's own family. It was as if heaven itself was responding to the spiritual darkness that had settled over the throne of David. Then came the prophet's letter. Elijah, that mighty man of God who had confronted Ahab and Jezebel in the northern kingdom, sent a message to King Jehoram that burned with divine judgment. The letter declared that because Jehoram had walked in the ways of the kings of Israel and had led Judah into idolatry, the Lord would strike his people, his children, his wives, and all his possessions with a great plague. The prophecy was terrifyingly specific. Jehoram himself would be afflicted with a severe disease of the bowels that would grow progressively worse until his intestines would literally fall out of his body. And that's exactly what happened. For 2 agonizing years, the king suffered from this horrible ailment, while his kingdom crumbled around him. When he finally died, the chronicler records that he departed with no one's regret. Even in death, he was dishonored, buried without the usual ceremonies reserved for kings of Judah. But Athaliah was far from finished. If anything, her husband's death only strengthened her resolve to seize control. She had tasted power as queen, and she was determined to hold on to it no matter what the cost might be. Her son Ahaziah, named after his grandfather King Ahab, was now on the throne, but he was young and inexperienced. Behind the scenes, his mother pulled the strings, continuing to poison the royal court with her mother's wicked legacy. Ahaziah's reign lasted only 1 year, but what a year it was. Under his mother's influence, he allied himself with the northern kingdom of Israel, specifically with his uncle Joram, the son of Ahab. Together, they went to war against Hazael, king of Syria, at Ramoth-Gilead. It was during this campaign that Joram was wounded and retreated to Jezreel to recover. Ahaziah, showing the family loyalty that Athaliah had instilled in him, went to visit his wounded uncle. But this act of kinship would prove to be his final mistake. God had already set in motion a plan to destroy the house of Ahab completely, and anyone associated with that wicked dynasty would be swept away in the coming judgment. The instrument of divine justice was a man named Jehu, a commander in the Israelite army who had been secretly anointed by one of Elisha's disciples to become the next king of Israel. Jehu's mission was clear and terrifying. He was to completely annihilate the house of Ahab, leaving no survivor, just as God had done to previous dynasties that had led Israel into sin. When Jehu arrived in Jezreel with his forces, he wasted no time in carrying out his divine commission. First, he killed Joram, shooting him with an arrow that pierced his heart. Then he turned his attention to Jezebel herself, the woman who had terrorized the prophets of the Lord, who had shed innocent blood and led 2 kingdoms into idolatry, met her end when she was thrown from a palace window by her own servants. Her body was trampled by horses and eaten by dogs, just as the prophet Elijah had foretold years earlier. But Ahaziah, king of Judah, was also in Jezreel at the time. When he saw what was happening to his relatives, he tried to flee, But Jehu's men pursued him. They wounded him as he escaped in his chariot, and though he managed to reach the city of Megiddo, he died there from his injuries. The son of Athaliah, the grandson of Jezebel, had been cut down in the prime of his life. Now here's where the story takes its most horrifying turn. When news reached Jerusalem that King Ahaziah was dead, a normal mother would have mourned. A normal grandmother would have gathered her grandchildren close and protected them during this time of crisis. A normal queen mother would have ensured a smooth transition of power to the next rightful heir. But Athaliah was not normal. The poison that had been flowing through her veins since childhood now reached its full potency. Instead of grief, she felt opportunity. Instead of maternal instinct, she experienced ruthless ambition. And instead of protecting the royal lineage, she decided to destroy it completely. The decision she made in that moment was so evil, so unthinkably cruel, that it defies comprehension. If her son was dead, then she would rule in her own right. But to do that, she would need to eliminate any potential rivals for the throne. And who were those potential rivals? Her own grandchildren, the sons and daughters of the man she had just lost. Think about this for a moment. These weren't political enemies or foreign threats. These were innocent children, some probably just toddlers, others perhaps teenagers. They were her own flesh and blood, the next generation of David's royal line. They had done nothing wrong except have the misfortune of being born into a family where their grandmother valued power more than love. But in Athaliah's twisted mind, these children represented obstacles to her ambition. As long as any of them lived, there would always be someone with a better claim to the throne than hers. As long as the royal seed of David survived, she would never truly be secure in her power. So she made a decision that would echo through history as one of the most monstrous acts ever committed by a human being. She ordered the systematic execution of every member of the royal family. The massacre that followed was swift and merciless. Palace guards who had sworn oaths to protect the royal family were now commanded to become their executioners. Servants who had watched these children take their first steps, speak their first words, were ordered to silence them forever. The very halls that should have been filled with laughter and the patter of little feet became chambers of horror where innocence was brutally extinguished. Can you imagine the terror that must have filled the palace that day? The screams that echoed through corridors where kings had once walked in majesty. The blood that stained floors where coronations had been celebrated. This wasn't warfare between armies or the heat of battle where men die with swords in their hands. This was the cold-blooded slaughter of defenseless children by their own grandmother. Athaliah moved through this carnage with calculated precision. She didn't delegate this horror to others and retreat to her chambers. No, she supervised it personally, making sure that every potential heir was found and killed. She checked and double-checked the bodies, ensuring that no child had escaped her notice. Her eyes, which should have looked upon these little ones with grandmother's love, instead searched for any sign of life that needed to be extinguished. The biblical record doesn't give us the gruesome details of how these murders were carried out, and perhaps that's a mercy. But we know that when Athaliah was finished with her work, she believed she had accomplished something unprecedented in the history of Israel. She had broken the unbroken chain of David's dynasty. She had severed the royal lineage that stretched back through generations of kings who had ruled by divine appointment. For 6 long years, Athaliah sat on the throne of Judah, ruling with the same iron fist that had characterized her family's reign in the northern kingdom. She established the worship of Baal in Jerusalem, tearing down altars to the true God and replacing them with shrines to the pagan deities her mother had served. The Temple of Solomon, that magnificent structure that had once been filled with the glory of the Lord, was defiled and neglected, while resources were poured into building temples for foreign gods. The priests and Levites who had served faithfully in the house of the Lord found themselves persecuted and marginalized. Many fled to the countryside or went into hiding, taking with them the sacred implements and scrolls that preserved the worship practices God had ordained. It was as if the spiritual light of Judah was being systematically extinguished, just as the physical light of David's lineage had been snuffed out in that terrible massacre. But Athaliah had made one critical error in her calculations. In her arrogance and bloodlust, she had overlooked something that would prove to be her ultimate downfall. Hidden in the very temple she was desecrating, protected by the very priests she was persecuting, was a secret that would shatter her reign and restore hope to a nation that had almost lost it forever. You see, there had been one person in the palace who couldn't stand by and watch innocent children be slaughtered without acting. Jehosheba, the daughter of King Jehoram and sister to the murdered King Ahaziah, had witnessed the beginning of her stepmother's rampage. As Athaliah's soldiers moved through the palace, systematically hunting down the royal children, Jehosheba made a split-second decision that would change the course of history. She had seen them coming for one particular child, a baby boy named Joash, who was the son of her dead brother Ahaziah. This infant, barely old enough to walk, was next on the list for execution. But as the soldiers approached, Jehosheba scooped up the child and his nurse and hid them in a bedroom. Then, with incredible courage and presence of mind, she managed to smuggle them out of the palace and into the temple of the Lord. Think about the risk she was taking. If Athaliah had discovered what Jehosheba had done, the punishment would have been swift and brutal. Jehosheba wasn't just defying a political decree, she was directly challenging the most dangerous and ruthless person in the kingdom. But sometimes, love is stronger than fear, and maternal instinct is more powerful than the threat of death. Jehosheba was married to Jehoiada, the high priest of the temple. Together, they made the decision to hide the child Joash in the very heart of the house of God. For 6 years, while Athaliah ruled with blood on her hands, convinced that she had destroyed every threat to her power, the rightful heir to David's throne was growing up just steps away from where she performed her pagan rituals. Can you see the divine irony in this situation? The woman who thought she had defeated God himself by destroying his chosen lineage was unknowingly providing protection for the very child who would one day overthrow her, while she defiled the outer courts of the temple with her Baal worship. The inner chambers housed the boy who carried the promise of restoration in his veins. Young Joash grew up surrounded by the priests and Levites who had remained faithful to the Lord. While other children his age were being taught to bow down to idols, he was learning the law of Moses and the history of his people. While Athaliah filled the kingdom with the sounds of pagan festivals and child sacrifice, Joash was hearing the ancient songs of Zion and learning the proper worship of the one true God. Jehoiada. The high priest became like a father to the boy, teaching him not just religious duties but the responsibilities that come with royal blood. This wasn't just about preserving a life, it was about preparing a king. Every day that passed was another day of training, another lesson in righteousness, another step toward the moment when David's throne would be reclaimed from the usurper who had stolen it through murder. But keeping this secret required incredible discipline and coordination among the temple staff. Everyone who came into contact with Joash had to be completely trustworthy. One careless word, one moment of indiscretion, and the child would be dead before sunset. The priest created an elaborate system to ensure his safety, rotating his hiding places, limiting his exposure to outsiders, and maintaining the fiction that he had died with all the other royal children. Meanwhile, Athaliah's reign was becoming increasingly oppressive and chaotic. Without the legitimacy that comes from rightful succession, she had to rule through fear and intimidation. The people of Judah knew she was a usurper, a murderer who had no claim to the throne except the blood on her hands. Discontent simmered beneath the surface of society, but no one dared to speak openly against her. The queen had surrounded herself with foreign advisors and mercenaries who shared her contempt for the traditions and laws of Judah. The justice system became corrupt, with verdicts going to the highest bidder, rather than being based on evidence and righteousness. The poor were oppressed, while the wealthy who supported Athaliah's regime grew richer through their association with her corrupt administration. Trade relationships with neighboring nations suffered as word spread about how Athaliah had come to power. What king wanted to make treaties with a woman who had murdered her own grandchildren? What ambassador felt safe negotiating with someone who had proven that family bonds meant nothing to her? Judah's reputation among the nations was in ruins, and its economy was beginning to suffer as a result. Religious festivals that had been celebrated for centuries were either banned outright or corrupted with pagan elements. The Passover, which commemorated God's deliverance of Israel from Egypt, was replaced with festivals honoring Baal. The Day of Atonement, when the nation's sins were symbolically transferred to a scapegoat, was ignored while the people were encouraged to participate in rituals that actually increased their guilt before God. But perhaps most tragically of all, an entire generation of children was growing up without knowledge of their true heritage. They didn't know the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They had never heard about Moses leading their ancestors out of slavery in Egypt. They were ignorant of the promises God had made to David about his dynasty lasting forever. In just 6 short years, Athaliah was succeeding in erasing the collective memory of a nation. Yet in the temple, surrounded by faithful priests and teachers, one small boy was learning all the things his generation was being denied. Joash was memorizing the Psalms his ancestor David had written. He was studying the laws that Moses had received on Mount Sinai. He was discovering his identity not just as a descendant of kings, but as a child of the covenant, chosen by God for a purpose that was greater than himself. As the years passed and Joash grew from a toddler into a young boy, Jehoiada began to formulate a plan. The time would come when the secret could no longer be kept, when the boy would need to take his rightful place as king of Judah. But revealing his identity would be incredibly dangerous, requiring careful timing and the support of people who could be trusted with their lives. The high priest began reaching out quietly to military commanders who had served under previous kings, men whose loyalty was to the throne itself, rather than to whoever happened to be sitting on it. He made contact with influential citizens who remembered the days when Judah had been ruled by righteous kings and who longed for those days to return. Slowly, carefully, he began building a network of support for the restoration that was to come. But Athaliah was not blind to the growing discontent in her kingdom. Her spies reported whispered conversations in the marketplaces, secret meetings among military officers, and a general sense that something was stirring beneath the surface of society. She responded with increased brutality, executing anyone suspected of disloyalty and tightening her grip on power through ever more oppressive measures. Little did she know that the greatest threat to her reign was not coming from outside conspirators or foreign enemies. The greatest threat was growing up right under her nose, in the very temple she had desecrated, being prepared by the very priests she had persecuted. The child whose death she had ordered 6 years earlier was alive, healthy, and learning everything he would need to know to reclaim his grandfather's throne. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of the kingdom. On one side stood Athaliah, the murderous usurper who had seized power through the blood of innocents and maintained it through fear and corruption. On the other side stood a young boy who represented everything she had tried to destroy, the living proof that God's promises cannot be defeated by human wickedness. The question was not whether this confrontation would come, but when and how it would unfold. And as Joash approached his 7th birthday, Jehoiada knew that the time for secrecy was drawing to a close. Soon, very soon, the people of Judah would discover that their rightful king was alive, and Athaliah would learn that her greatest nightmare had been sleeping just steps away from her throne for 6 long years. The turning point came when Joash reached his 7th year. Jehoiada could see that the boy was ready not just in age, but in understanding of what lay ahead. The child who had been hidden away like a precious treasure was now old enough to comprehend the weight of his destiny. He understood that he was the last surviving member of David's royal line, the one person standing between Judah and complete spiritual destruction. But revealing Joash would require more than just courage. It would demand perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and the coordination of dozens of people who would literally be risking their lives for this moment. One mistake, one betrayal, one moment of hesitation, and everything would be lost. Not just Joash's life, but the future of the entire kingdom. Jehoiada began his preparations with the methodical precision of a military strategist. He knew that Athaliah's power rested on two pillars: her control of the royal guard and her network of foreign mercenaries. If he could neutralize both of these advantages simultaneously, the usurper queen would find herself completely defenseless when the moment of truth arrived. The high priest started by reaching out to the captains of the guard, the professional soldiers who were responsible for protecting the palace and maintaining order in Jerusalem. These weren't foreign mercenaries or political appointees. These were career military men who had served under multiple kings and whose loyalty was to the institution of the monarchy rather than to any individual ruler. Many of these captains had been deeply troubled by Athaliah's rise to power. They had been forced to participate in the massacre of the royal children, following orders that went against every instinct of honor and duty they possessed. For 6 years they had served a woman they knew was a murderer and a usurper, waiting for someone to give them a legitimate alternative. When Jehoiada approached them with his proposal, he didn't reveal everything at once. Instead, he tested their loyalty carefully, feeling out their attitudes toward the current regime and their willingness to support a change in leadership. What he discovered was a group of men who were hungry for righteousness, desperate for a chance to serve a legitimate king once again. The high priest's plan was brilliant in its simplicity. He would use the changing of the guard at the temple as cover for his revolution. Every Sabbath, new contingents of soldiers came on duty while others went off duty. This regular rotation provided the perfect opportunity to gather loyal troops without arousing suspicion from Athaliah's spies. Jehoiada chose 5 captains who would be crucial to the success of his plan. These were men whose integrity was beyond question and whose influence over their subordinates was absolute. When he finally revealed to them that a son of Ahaziah was alive and hidden in the temple, their reaction was everything he had hoped for. Instead of shock or disbelief, they showed immediate recognition that this was the answer to their prayers. But the high priest knew that revealing Joash would be only half the battle. The other half would be ensuring that Athaliah couldn't rally her supporters and launch a counterattack. This meant that the revolution would have to be swift, decisive, and overwhelming. There could be no room for hesitation or mercy once the process began. The plan that emerged from these secret meetings was audacious in scope. On the appointed Sabbath, instead of the usual changing of the guard, 3 groups of soldiers would take up positions around the temple. One group would guard the palace gates, preventing any of Athaliah's loyalists from entering or leaving. Another group would secure the temple entrances, ensuring that no unauthorized persons could interfere with the ceremony that was about to take place. The third group would form a protective cordon around the young king, ready to defend him with their lives if necessary. Jehoiada also made sure to arm these soldiers with weapons from the temple treasury. These weren't just any weapons, but the spears and shields that had belonged to King David himself, sacred implements that had been stored in the house of the Lord for generations. By placing these weapons in the hands of his supporters, the high priest was making a powerful symbolic statement about the legitimacy of what they were about to do. The psychological impact of this choice cannot be overstated. When the soldiers saw themselves holding the actual weapons of Israel's greatest king, they felt a connection to the golden age of their nation's history. They were no longer just following the orders of a priest. They were participating in the restoration of God's chosen dynasty. As the fateful Sabbath approached, word began to spread quietly through certain circles in Jerusalem. The priests and Levites who had remained faithful to the Lord were told that something momentous was about to happen. Influential citizens who had been secretly hoping for change were given cryptic messages suggesting they should be near the temple on a particular day. Even some members of the royal court who had grown disillusioned with Athaliah's rule received subtle hints that their patience was about to be rewarded. But Athaliah herself remained completely oblivious to the conspiracy forming right under her nose. She had grown complacent in her power, confident that her enemies had been eliminated years ago. The very success of her initial massacre had made her careless, unable to imagine that anyone would dare challenge her authority after witnessing what she was capable of doing to those who opposed her. On that chosen Sabbath morning, everything proceeded exactly as Jehoiada had planned. The soldiers took their positions without arousing suspicion. The temple was secured and the palace was isolated. And then, in a moment that must have felt like the earth itself was shifting, 7-year-old Joash was brought out from his hiding place and presented to the assembled crowd. Can you imagine the shock that rippled through the people when they saw him? Here was a child who was supposed to be dead, whose murder had been the foundation of Athaliah's claim to power. Yet there he stood, alive and healthy, bearing the unmistakable features of the royal family. For many of those present, it must have felt like witnessing a resurrection, seeing someone return from the grave to reclaim what had been stolen from him. Jehoiada wasted no time in formalizing what was happening. He brought out the crown and the testimony, the royal insignia that symbolized legitimate kingship in Judah. In front of hundreds of witnesses, he placed the crown upon Joash's head and anointed him with oil, just as Samuel had anointed David centuries earlier. The rightful king of Judah had been restored to his throne. The response from the crowd was immediate and overwhelming. These people had lived for 6 years under the oppressive rule of a murderous usurper, watching their nation's traditions be destroyed and their God be dishonored. Now they saw hope incarnate standing before them in the form of a small boy who represented everything Athaliah had tried to destroy. They clapped their hands, they shouted, they sang songs of joy that had been silent for too long. The sound of genuine celebration filled the temple courts, a sound that had been absent from Jerusalem since before Athaliah's bloody coup. For the first time in years, the people of Judah had reason to believe that their nation's future might be brighter than its recent past. But even as this celebration was reaching its peak, Athaliah was about to receive the shock of her life. The noise from the temple was so loud that it could be heard throughout the city, and it was unlike anything that had occurred during her reign. This wasn't the sound of forced compliance or fearful obedience. This was the sound of genuine joy, of people celebrating something they truly believed in. When reports reached the palace that large crowds had gathered at the temple and that some kind of ceremony was taking place, Athaliah initially dismissed it as a religious festival of no political significance. But as the noise continued to grow and more detailed reports began to arrive, she realized that something unprecedented was happening. The queen who had murdered children in their beds, who had ruled through terror and intimidation, who had thought herself invincible in her stolen power, suddenly felt the first stirrings of genuine fear. The crowds weren't just celebrating, they were chanting something that made her blood run cold. They were shouting, "Long live the king!" over and over again, with an enthusiasm that suggested this wasn't just wishful thinking, but a response to something real. Against the advice of her remaining counselors, Athaliah decided to investigate personally. She couldn't believe that anyone would dare proclaim a new king without her knowledge or permission. In her arrogance, she probably thought she could simply show up and disperse the crowd through the force of her presence, as she had done so many times before. But when she arrived at the temple and pushed her way through the crowd, what she saw defied everything she thought she knew about her own success. There, standing on the platform, where kings had been crowned for generations, was a child wearing the royal crown. And not just any child, but one whose face bore features she recognized. Features that belonged to the family she thought she had completely wiped out. The moment Athaliah laid eyes on Joash, she knew exactly who he was and what his presence meant. This was her grandson, the son of Ahaziah, the boy whose death she had ordered along with all the other royal children. Yet here he stood, alive and crowned, surrounded by cheering crowds who clearly accepted him as their legitimate ruler. In that instant, Athaliah's entire world collapsed. The foundation of her power had been the belief that she was the only surviving member of the royal family, the only person with any claim to rule Judah. But if this child was alive, then her claim was not just illegitimate, but absurd. Worse yet, his very existence proved that she had failed in the most crucial aspect of her coup, the elimination of all potential rivals. The usurper queen's reaction was swift and predictable. She tore her clothes in a gesture of rage and despair and began screaming the words that would become her final political statement. Treason! Treason! But even as she shouted these accusations, she must have realized how hollow they sounded. She was calling treason on the restoration of the rightful king, the very person she had tried to murder years earlier. The crowd's response to Athaliah's appearance was immediate and hostile. These were people who had suffered under her rule, who had watched their nation's traditions be destroyed and their God be dishonored. They had no sympathy for her distress and no patience for her claims of treason. If anyone was guilty of treason, it was the woman who had murdered the royal family and usurped the throne through violence. But Jehoiada had anticipated this moment and prepared for it carefully. He had given strict instructions to his supporters about how Athaliah should be handled when she inevitably appeared. The high priest understood that how they dealt with the deposed queen would set the tone for the new reign and demonstrate whether this revolution was about justice or merely revenge. The orders were clear and specific. Athaliah was not to be killed in the temple itself, as that would defile the holy place with blood. Instead, she was to be taken outside and executed there, away from the sacred ground where the new king had just been crowned. This wasn't just about ritual purity, it was about making a statement that the new regime would be different from the old one, governed by law and reverence, rather than by arbitrary violence. As the soldiers moved to arrest her, Athaliah must have realized that her 6-year reign of terror was coming to an end. The woman who had shown no mercy to innocent children, who had ruled through fear and brutality, who had thought herself untouchable in her stolen power, now found herself completely helpless before the justice she had so long avoided. The crowd parted as the soldiers led her away, and their silence was more ominous than any shouts of anger would have been. These people had seen what Athaliah was capable of when she held power over others. Now they were witnessing what happened when that power was stripped away and she faced the consequences of her actions. When they reached the horse gate of the king's house, the place where Athaliah's own horses had once carried her in royal procession, the soldiers carried out their orders. The woman who had murdered her way to the throne died by the sword, just as she had lived. Her reign of terror was over, ended not by foreign invasion or natural disaster, but by the very thing she had tried so hard to prevent, the restoration of David's rightful heir. But even as Athaliah breathed her last, the real work of restoration was just beginning. Crowning Joash had been the easy part compared to what lay ahead. The new king was only 7 years old, which meant that others would have to govern in his name until he came of age. The kingdom had been devastated by 6 years of corrupt rule, its institutions weakened, its people demoralized, its relationship with God severely damaged. Jehoiada understood the magnitude of the task before them. This wasn't just about changing rulers, it was about rebuilding a nation from the ground up. The temples to Baal that Athaliah had erected would need to be torn down. The worship of the true God would need to be restored. The law of Moses would need to be taught again to a people who had been systematically cut off from their spiritual heritage. Most importantly of all, the young king himself would need to be carefully guided and educated. Joash had spent his entire life in hiding, protected from the harsh realities of royal responsibility. Now he would need to learn not just how to rule, but how to rule righteously, in a way that would honor God and serve his people rather than enriching himself at their expense. The high priest made a covenant that day, not just between himself and the king, but between the king and the people, and between all of them and the Lord. This wasn't just a political agreement, it was a spiritual commitment to return to the ways that had made Judah great in the first place. They were pledging themselves to be the Lord's people once again, governed by his laws and blessed by his presence. The response from the people was immediate and enthusiastic. They went to the house of Baal that Athaliah had built and tore it down completely, destroying its altars and smashing its images into pieces. They killed Matan, the priest of Baal, who had led the nation into idolatry, and appointed faithful priests to oversee the restoration of proper worship in the temple of the Lord. For the first time in 6 years, the sound of proper worship filled the temple courts. The Levites took up their instruments and led the people in singing the songs of David. The sacrifices that God had ordained were offered again, and the smoke of properly prepared offerings rose toward heaven. It must have felt like the nation was awakening from a nightmare and remembering what it was supposed to be. But perhaps the most significant moment of all came when young King Joash was brought to the palace and placed upon the throne that had been stolen from his family. The child who had grown up in hiding, who had learned about kingship from books and stories rather than experience, now sat in the seat of his ancestors. David's throne was occupied once again by David's heir, and the promise that God had made centuries earlier was still being fulfilled. The people rejoiced with a joy that came from deep within their hearts. This wasn't the forced celebration that had characterized Athaliah's reign, where people cheered because they were afraid not to. This was genuine happiness, the response of a people who had been given back their identity and their hope. The land was quiet, the chronicler tells us, because the nightmare was finally over. The restoration of Joash marked more than just a change of rulers. It represented the triumph of divine providence over human wickedness, the victory of faith over fear, and the proof that God's promises cannot be thwarted by even the most determined attempts to destroy them. But as the cheers of celebration echoed through Jerusalem and the smoke of proper sacrifices once again rose from the temple altar, a sobering reality began to settle over the kingdom. Young King Joash was only 7 years old. While his bloodline gave him the right to rule, his age made him completely dependent on others for guidance and wisdom. The weight of kingship that had crushed grown men would now rest on the shoulders of a child who had spent his entire life in hiding. The question that haunted everyone who truly cared about Judah's future was simple yet terrifying. Would this boy grow up to be the righteous king his people desperately needed? Or would the corrupting influence of power eventually claim him as it had claimed so many others? Jehoiada the high priest understood this challenge better than anyone. He had risked everything to preserve Joash's life and restore him to the throne. But preservation and restoration were only the beginning. The real test would come in the years ahead, as the boy king matured and began to assert his own will. Would the lessons learned in the temple chambers prove strong enough to withstand the temptations that would inevitably come with absolute power? The high priest's first priority was establishing a stable regency that could govern effectively while Joash grew to maturity. This wasn't simply a matter of maintaining order. It was about rebuilding an entire kingdom from the foundation up. Athaliah's 6-year reign had left deep scars that would take decades to heal. The institutions of government had been corrupted, the military had been compromised by foreign influence, and most critically of all, an entire generation had grown up without proper knowledge of their covenant relationship with God. Jehoiada began this monumental task by surrounding the young king with counselors whose loyalty was unquestionable and whose wisdom was proven. These weren't political appointees seeking personal advantage, but men who had demonstrated their commitment to righteousness even when it meant personal risk. Many of them were priests and Levites who had maintained their faith during the dark years of Athaliah's rule, but others were military officers and civic leaders who had quietly preserved their integrity while serving under the usurper queen. The establishment of this righteous council sent a powerful message throughout the kingdom. Unlike Athaliah, who had ruled through fear and surrounded herself with foreign advisors who shared her contempt for Judah's traditions, the new regime would be guided by men who understood the nation's history and were committed to its spiritual heritage. The contrast couldn't have been more stark or more encouraging to a people who had almost lost hope. But rebuilding trust in governmental institutions was only part of the challenge. The more fundamental problem was spiritual, and it required a complete transformation of how the people of Judah understood their relationship with God. For 6 years, they had been taught that the Lord was either powerless or irrelevant, that Baal and other foreign deities offered more reliable protection and prosperity. Breaking through this deception would require more than just words. It would demand visible demonstrations of God's power and faithfulness. Jehoiada began this spiritual restoration by focusing on the temple itself, which had been neglected and partially defiled during Athaliah's reign. The physical structure needed repair, but more importantly, the worship practices that had been corrupted or abandoned needed to be restored to their original purity. This wasn't just about following ritual requirements. It was about re-establishing the connection between heaven and earth that had been severed by years of idolatry. The high priest organized massive work crews to clean and repair the temple buildings, but he made sure that every aspect of this restoration was carried out according to the detailed instructions that God had given through Moses and David. Nothing was left to chance or personal preference. Every stone that was replaced, every piece of metalwork that was restored, every textile that was rewoven had to conform exactly to the divine specifications that had made the temple a suitable dwelling place for God's presence. As this physical restoration progressed, something remarkable began to happen. The people who participated in the work started to experience a spiritual renewal that went far beyond what anyone had expected. Men who had spent years bowing down to idols found themselves overwhelmed with emotion as they handled the sacred implements that their ancestors had used in proper worship. Women who had taught their children to honor false gods discovered tears streaming down their faces as they helped prepare the temple for renewed service. This wasn't mere nostalgia or emotional manipulation. It was the Holy Spirit working in the hearts of people who had been cut off from their spiritual heritage, but never completely abandoned by the God they had been taught to forget. As they worked with their hands to restore the physical temple, God was working in their hearts to restore the spiritual temple of their relationship with Him. Young Joash participated in this restoration process as much as his age would allow, and the experience profoundly shaped his understanding of what it meant to be king of Judah. Unlike previous monarchs who had inherited functioning institutions and established traditions, he was witnessing the actual rebuilding of his kingdom from the ground up. Every decision that was made, every policy that was established, every ritual that was restored had to be carefully considered and deliberately chosen. This unique perspective gave the boy king an appreciation for the sacred nature of his responsibilities that might have been impossible to achieve in any other circumstances. He wasn't just sitting on a throne that had been passed down to him. He was actively participating in the restoration of that throne's rightful place in God's plan for his people. The crown on his head wasn't just a symbol of inherited privilege. It was a reminder of divine calling and sacred duty. Jehoiada made sure that Joash's education during these crucial early years focused not just on the practical skills of leadership, but on the spiritual principles that should guide every decision a king makes. The boy studied the law of Moses intensively, learning not just what God had commanded, but why those commands were given, and how they protected both the king and his people from the corrupting influence of absolute power. The history of Israel's previous kings became a central part of this curriculum, but not in the way it was typically taught to royal children. Instead of focusing on military victories and territorial expansion, Jehoiada emphasized the spiritual lessons that could be learned from each reign. Why had some kings been blessed with long life and prosperity, while others had been cut down in their prime? What distinguished the rulers who had been honored by God from those who had been rejected by him? These weren't abstract theological discussions. They were intensely practical preparations for the choices that Joash would eventually face as an adult king. Every historical example was chosen to illustrate a principle that would be relevant to his future decision-making. Every biblical story was connected to contemporary challenges that the restored kingdom was already beginning to encounter. As the months turned into years and Joash grew from a small child into a young boy, the wisdom of Jehoiada's educational approach became increasingly evident. The king wasn't just memorizing facts and rules. He was developing a framework for thinking about leadership that was fundamentally different from what had characterized previous generations. His understanding of royal authority was shaped by humility rather than pride, by service rather than self-interest, by accountability to God rather than the pursuit of personal glory. This transformation in the king's character was reflected in the policies that began to emerge from his court. Instead of the arbitrary decrees that had marked Athaliah's reign, the new government operated according to clearly established principles that were applied consistently regardless of personal relationships or political considerations. Justice wasn't for sale to the highest bidder. It was administered according to the standards that God had revealed through Moses. The military, which had been corrupted by foreign influence and used primarily to maintain internal control during the usurper's reign, was restructured according to the organizational principles that David had established centuries earlier. Officers were chosen based on merit and character, rather than political loyalty or family connections. Training focused not just on tactical skills, but on the moral responsibilities that came with bearing arms in defense of God's chosen people. Trade relationships with neighboring nations were re-established, but on terms that reflected Judah's renewed commitment to its covenant identity. The kingdom wouldn't simply pursue economic advantage at any cost. It would maintain its integrity even when doing so required financial sacrifice. This principled approach to international relations gradually restored the respect that Judah had lost during Athaliah's reign and opened up opportunities for profitable cooperation with nations that valued reliability and honor. Perhaps most importantly of all, the educational system throughout the kingdom was completely reformed. During Athaliah's reign, an entire generation had grown up in spiritual ignorance, cut off from the knowledge of their heritage and their God. Now, systematic efforts were made to ensure that every child in Judah would learn the fundamental truths that their parents had been denied. This wasn't just religious instruction in the narrow sense. It was comprehensive education that integrated spiritual truth with practical knowledge, that connected faith with daily life, and that prepared young people to be productive citizens of a kingdom that was committed to righteousness. Children learned to read using the scrolls of Scripture. They studied mathematics through the calculation of temple offerings, and they explored history through the stories of their ancestors' relationship with God. The impact of these educational reforms extended far beyond the classroom. Families that had been fractured by years of moral confusion began to heal as parents and children discovered a shared foundation for their values and relationships. Communities that had been divided by suspicion and fear started to rebuild bonds of trust based on common commitment to principles that transcended personal interest. But even as these positive changes were taking root throughout the kingdom, Jehoiada was keenly aware that the ultimate test of the restoration was still to come. Joash was growing up in an artificial environment, surrounded by people who were committed to his success and shielded from the worst temptations that typically corrupted young rulers. The real question was, what would happen when he began to exercise independent authority and face challenges that his advisors couldn't solve for him? The high priest had studied the history of Judah's kings carefully, and he understood the pattern that had repeated itself generation after generation. Young rulers who started with good intentions often gradually compromised their principles as they encountered the practical difficulties of leadership. The pressure to achieve quick results, the temptation to take shortcuts that seemed harmless, the gradual erosion of accountability as power became more concentrated. These were the forces that had destroyed the spiritual integrity of even well-meaning kings. Jehoiada's strategy for protecting Joash from this predictable pattern was both simple and revolutionary. Instead of trying to shield the young king from all difficult decisions, he began gradually exposing him to increasingly complex challenges while maintaining close oversight and guidance. The goal wasn't to make things easy for Joash, but to help him develop the spiritual muscles he would need to resist temptation when he was no longer under direct supervision. This approach required incredible wisdom and patience. Jehoiada had to know when to step in with advice and when to allow the young king to learn from his own mistakes. He had to balance the need for Joash to develop independence with the recognition that premature autonomy could be spiritually disastrous. Most difficult of all, he had to maintain his own humility and resist the temptation to hold on to power for its own sake. As Joash entered his teenage years, the dynamic between the king and his mentor began to evolve in ways that would ultimately determine the success or failure of the entire restoration project. The boy who had once depended completely on Jehoiada's guidance was beginning to assert his own opinions and preferences. The relationship that had been characterized by unquestioning trust was starting to include elements of tension and disagreement. This development wasn't necessarily negative, but it was dangerous. Joash's growing confidence was a sign of healthy maturation, but it also created opportunities for pride and rebellion that could destroy everything that had been accomplished. The young king was beginning to experience the intoxicating effects of unchallenged authority, the subtle corruption that comes when everyone around you is eager to please and reluctant to contradict. Jehoiada watched these changes with growing concern, knowing that the crucial moment was approaching when Joash would have to choose between the path of humility that had been mapped out for him and the path of self-will that had destroyed so many of his predecessors. The high priest's influence was still strong, but he could feel it beginning to wane as the king's confidence in his own judgment grew stronger. The test came sooner than anyone expected, triggered by a crisis that forced Joash to make decisions that would reveal the true direction of his heart. A coalition of enemy nations had assembled on Judah's borders, threatening to invade unless substantial tribute was paid. The military advisors were divided on whether the kingdom's forces were strong enough to resist an invasion, and the financial advisors warned that paying tribute would drain the royal treasury and possibly bankrupt the government. This was exactly the kind of situation that had tempted previous kings to compromise their principles in pursuit of expedient solutions. The easy path would be to strip gold and silver from the temple, to pay the tribute, or to form alliances with other pagan nations that could provide military support in exchange for religious concessions. Both options had been used by earlier rulers, and both had led to spiritual disaster for the kingdom. Jehoiada counseled patience and prayer, arguing that God would provide a solution if they remained faithful to their covenant obligations. But other voices in the court were pressing for immediate action, warning that delay would only make the situation worse. For the first time in his reign, Joash found himself at the center of a debate where his mentor's advice was being openly challenged by other advisors who claimed to have his best interests at heart. The young king's response to this crisis would reveal whether the spiritual foundation that had been so carefully laid during his early years was strong enough to withstand the pressure of real-world leadership. Would he trust in the God who had preserved his life and restored his throne? Or would he rely on his own understanding and the counsel of those who promised quick solutions to complex problems? The decision he made would echo through the remaining years of his reign and ultimately determine whether the restoration that had begun with such promise would endure or crumble under the weight of human weakness. The boy who had been hidden in the temple was about to face the greatest test of his life, and the outcome would affect not just his own destiny, but the spiritual future of an entire nation. As the pressure mounted and the deadline for decision approached, Joash found himself standing at the same crossroads that had confronted every king who had sat on David's throne. Would he choose the narrow path of faithfulness that led to life? Or would he take the broad road of compromise that seemed easier, but ultimately led to destruction? The choice was his to make, and the consequences would reverberate through generations yet to come. The weight of that decision pressed down on 17-year-old Joash like a physical burden. For the first time in his life, he was truly alone with the consequences of absolute power. The advisors had presented their arguments, the military commanders had outlined their strategies, and the treasury officials had calculated their resources down to the last shekel. Now, in the quiet of his private chambers, the young king had to choose a path that would define not just his reign, but his character. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very temple where he had been hidden as a child, the sacred place that had protected him from his grandmother's murderous rage, was now being discussed as a potential source of tribute money. The gold and silver vessels that had been consecrated for worship, the treasures that generations of faithful kings had donated to honor God, were being eyed as solutions to a political crisis. It was as if the serpent of compromise was whispering the same seductive lies that had destroyed his ancestors. Jehoiada had taught him about moments like this, those pivotal points where a king's true heart is revealed. The high priest had used the examples of Solomon, who started in wisdom but ended in folly, and Hezekiah, who trusted God against impossible odds and saw miraculous deliverance. But knowing the stories was different from living them. Standing in the gap between faith and fear, between trust and pragmatism, Joash felt the crushing loneliness that comes with ultimate responsibility. The voices of compromise seemed so reasonable, so practical. His military advisors weren't wicked men plotting his downfall. They were experienced professionals genuinely concerned about the kingdom's survival. When they argued that paying tribute would buy time to strengthen defenses, their logic was sound. When they pointed out that the enemy forces vastly outnumbered Judah's army, their assessment was accurate. When they warned that resistance might lead to complete devastation, their concerns were legitimate. But there was another voice, quieter but more persistent, that echoed the lessons learned in those temple chambers, where he'd grown from child to king. It was the voice of his spiritual heritage, the accumulated wisdom of prophets and priests, who had faced similar crises and found that God's ways, though often mysterious, were always ultimately vindictive. This voice reminded him that David had faced Goliath with nothing but stones and faith, that Jehoshaphat had seen enemy armies destroy each other, while Judah sang praises, that Hezekiah had watched the angel of the Lord devastate the Assyrian forces in a single night. The young king spent 3 days in fasting and prayer, seeking the clarity that seemed so elusive when surrounded by the urgent whispers of advisors and the pressing demands of immediate decision-making. In the silence of those long hours, away from the political calculations and military strategies, a different kind of wisdom began to emerge. It wasn't the wisdom of human experience or earthly prudence, but the deeper understanding that comes when finite minds submit to infinite truth. On the morning of the 4th day, Joash emerged from his chambers with a peace that surprised everyone who saw him. The tension that had marked his features for weeks was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that seemed to radiate from somewhere deep within his spirit. When he called for his advisors to assemble, There was something in his demeanor that suggested the agonizing uncertainty was over. The decision he announced stunned both his supporters and his critics. Instead of paying tribute or seeking military alliances, the king declared a kingdom-wide fast and called for all the people of Judah to gather at the temple for prayer and repentance. This wasn't the response anyone had expected, and the immediate reaction ranged from confusion to barely concealed panic. How could prayer and fasting stop enemy armies? What possible military value could religious ceremonies have against real swords and spears? But Joash had learned something during those solitary hours that his advisors hadn't grasped. The crisis facing Judah wasn't ultimately military or political, it was spiritual. The enemy coalition had formed not because of Judah's weakness, but because of its growing strength. The kingdom's return to covenant faithfulness, its renewed prosperity under righteous leadership, and its influence among neighboring nations had created jealousy and fear among rulers who preferred chaos to order, corruption to justice. The young king's response drew directly from the playbook that had worked for his ancestors in similar situations. Instead of matching earthly power with earthly power, he chose to appeal to the source of all power. Instead of trusting in horses and chariots, he decided to trust in the name of the Lord his God. It was a decision that required more courage than any battlefield charge, more faith than any diplomatic negotiation. Jehoiada watched this transformation with a mixture of pride and amazement. The boy he had raised and taught was becoming the man God had called him to be, not through human wisdom or political calculation, but through spiritual discernment that transcended natural understanding. The high priest realized that his years of careful instruction and patient guidance were finally bearing fruit in ways he had hardly dared to hope. The response from the people was extraordinary. When word spread throughout Judah that the king was calling for fasting and prayer rather than military mobilization, something awakened in the collective heart of the nation. These were people who remembered the stories of God's faithfulness, even if they had lived through years when those stories seemed like ancient myths. The call to spiritual warfare resonated with something deeper than patriotism or political loyalty. It touched the covenant identity that had never been completely extinguished. From every village and town, from every farm and workshop, the people came. They brought their families, their fears, and their faith to the temple courts, where their ancestors had worshipped for centuries. The sight was breathtaking. Thousands upon thousands of people, united not by military strategy or political ideology, but by shared dependence on the God who had called their nation into existence and sustained it through countless crises. The prayer meeting that followed was unlike anything that had been seen since the dedication of Solomon's temple. There was no formal liturgy, no scripted ceremony, just the spontaneous outpouring of hearts that recognized their absolute dependence on divine intervention. Men who had served in multiple armies wept as they confessed their fear and acknowledged their need for supernatural deliverance. Women who had raised children under the shadow of enemy threats poured out their maternal anguish and pleaded for protection that only heaven could provide. Young King Joash stood before this massive assembly and did something that shocked even his closest advisors. Instead of delivering a stirring speech about military strategy or national determination, he publicly acknowledged his own inadequacy for the crisis they faced. This wasn't false humility or political theatre. It was the genuine recognition of a young leader who understood that some challenges are too great for human solutions. The king's prayer that day became legendary in Judah's history, not because of its eloquent language or theological sophistication, but because of its raw honesty and desperate faith. He reminded God of the promises made to David, the covenant established with Abraham, and the faithfulness shown to previous generations who had faced impossible odds. But more than reciting history, he threw himself and his kingdom completely on divine mercy, acknowledging that without supernatural intervention, they were doomed. What happened next defied every principle of military science and political strategy that the ancient world understood. Instead of the expected invasion, Reports began reaching Jerusalem that the enemy coalition was fragmenting. Internal disputes had erupted among the allied commanders, accusations of treachery were flying back and forth, and what had been a unified threat was rapidly dissolving into chaos and mutual suspicion. Within a week, the massive army that had seemed poised to devastate Judah was in complete disarray. Some contingents had already retreated to their home territories. Others were engaged in skirmishes with former allies, and the remaining forces were too busy defending themselves from each other to pose any threat to Judah's borders. The crisis that had seemed insurmountable had evaporated without a single battle being fought by Judean forces. The impact of this deliverance on King Joash was profound and permanent. He had experienced firsthand the reality of divine intervention, the power of covenant faithfulness, and the wisdom of trusting God's ways over human understanding. The lesson burned itself into his consciousness with an intensity that would shape every subsequent decision of his reign. When facing impossible circumstances, the answer wasn't compromise or cleverness. It was faith. News of Judah's miraculous deliverance spread throughout the region like wildfire, creating a reputation that provided better security than any military alliance could have offered. Neighboring kingdoms that had been considering their own aggressive moves suddenly found reasons to pursue diplomatic solutions instead. The young king, who had been dismissed as naive and idealistic, was now regarded with a mixture of respect and supernatural dread that made potential enemies think twice before challenging his kingdom. But perhaps the most significant consequence of this crisis was the effect it had on Joash's relationship with Jehoiada. The young king's spiritual maturity had been tested under the most intense pressure imaginable, and he had chosen correctly without needing to be guided or corrected by his mentor. The high priest realized that his student had truly become a king in his own right, capable of seeking God's will independently and following it regardless of human opposition. This realization brought both joy and sadness to the aging high priest. Joy, because he had succeeded in his most important responsibility, raising a king who would serve God faithfully. Sadness, because he understood that his role as primary advisor and spiritual guide was naturally evolving as Joash grew into full spiritual maturity. The relationship that had sustained both of them through years of challenge and growth was entering a new phase that would require adjustments from both men. For Joash, the successful resolution of this crisis marked the end of his spiritual adolescence and the beginning of his mature reign. He had proven to himself, to his people, and to the watching world that he was capable of making decisions based on divine wisdom rather than human calculation. The boy who had been hidden in the temple was now truly the king of Judah, not just by birthright, but by character and calling. The years that followed were marked by unprecedented prosperity and peace. The kingdom's commitment to covenant faithfulness attracted God's blessing in ways that were visible to everyone. Harvests were abundant, trade relationships flourished, and the population grew steadily as people from other nations sought to live under Judah's righteous government. The temple became a center of pilgrimage and worship that drew visitors from across the known world. Joash used this prosperity wisely, investing in infrastructure projects that would benefit future generations. Roads were built and maintained, educational systems were expanded, and the military was strengthened not for conquest but for defense. The king understood that true security came from righteousness rather than military might, but he also recognized the practical need to be prepared for those who didn't share his commitment to peace. The temple, which had been the center of his childhood refuge and the source of his spiritual education, became the focus of the king's most ambitious project. The building that had protected him during Athaliah's reign and witnessed his coronation needed extensive renovation to restore it to its original glory. But this wasn't just about maintaining a historical monument. It was about providing a worthy dwelling place for the presence of God among his people. King Joash approached the temple renovation with the same spiritual seriousness that had characterized his response to the military crisis. Every detail was planned according to the specifications that God had given through Moses and David. Every worker was chosen for character as well as skill, and every material was selected for its excellence rather than its cost. The project became a kingdom-wide effort that united the people around a shared vision of honoring their God through their finest craftsmanship. The funding for this massive undertaking came from voluntary contributions rather than taxation, reflecting the king's understanding that worship must flow from the heart rather than being compelled by governmental authority. The response from the people was overwhelming, with offerings pouring in from every level of society. Wealthy merchants contributed gold and silver, skilled artisans donated their labor, and even the poorest families brought what they could afford as expressions of gratitude for the peace and prosperity they were enjoying. But as the temple renovation progressed and Joash entered the prime years of his reign, subtle changes began to occur that would ultimately determine the legacy of his kingship. The success and prosperity that had followed his faithful decisions were gradually creating a different kind of temptation than the crisis he had faced as a young ruler. Instead of the pressure to compromise in the face of external threats, he now faced the more insidious danger of spiritual complacency that often accompanies material blessing. The warning signs were small at first, barely noticeable to those who weren't watching carefully. The king's prayer life, which had been so intense during times of crisis, became more routine and less desperate. His dependence on Jehoiada's counsel, which had been complete during his youth, began to diminish as his confidence in his own judgment grew. The humility that had characterized his early decisions started to give way to a subtle pride in his achievements and abilities. Jehoiada, now in his 80s, watched these developments with growing concern. He had seen this pattern before in other kings, the gradual drift from dependence on God to reliance on human wisdom and accomplishment. The high priest understood that prosperity could be even more spiritually dangerous than adversity, because it created the illusion that success came from personal ability rather than divine grace. The aging mentor tried to address these concerns through gentle counsel and loving correction, but he found that his words no longer carried the same weight they had during Joash's youth. The king still respected him and sought his advice on important matters, but there was a subtle shift in their relationship that suggested Joash was beginning to see himself as Jehoiada's equal rather than his student. This wasn't necessarily wrong. Mature kings should be able to make independent decisions, but it created opportunities for pride and self-deception that could be spiritually fatal. The crisis that would reveal the true direction of Joash's heart was still years away, waiting like a hidden fault line beneath the surface of apparent success and stability. The king who had chosen faith over fear in his youth would eventually face an even more difficult test, whether he could maintain that same faithfulness when surrounded by prosperity, praise, and the intoxicating illusion of self-sufficiency. The boy, who had been rescued from his grandmother's murderous rage, had grown into a man of power and influence, but the greatest battles of his reign were still ahead. The external enemies had been defeated through divine intervention, but the internal enemies of pride, complacency, and spiritual drift were more dangerous than any army because they attacked the very source of his strength, his relationship with the God who had preserved and blessed him. As Jehoiada aged and his influence waned, and as Joash's confidence in his own abilities grew stronger, the stage was being set for a confrontation that would test everything the young king had learned and determine whether the restoration that had begun with such promise would endure or crumble under the weight of human frailty. The temple renovation was nearing completion. The kingdom was at peace, and prosperity seemed guaranteed for generations to come. But beneath the surface of this apparent success, forces were at work that would soon reveal whether King Joash had truly learned the lessons of his extraordinary youth, or whether he would join the long list of rulers who had started well but finished poorly, leaving behind kingdoms that were weaker rather than stronger because of their reign. The answer to that question would come sooner than anyone expected, triggered by an event that shook the very foundations of the kingdom. Jehoiada, the high priest who had risked everything to preserve Joash's life and guide his reign, was dying. The man who had been father, teacher, mentor, and spiritual anchor to the king, was approaching the end of his extraordinary life, and with his passing, the last restraining influence on Joash's growing pride would be removed. The high priest's final illness stretched over several months, giving both men time to prepare for a transition that would fundamentally alter the character of the kingdom. During those long conversations in Jehoiada's chambers, the aging mentor tried desperately to impress upon his spiritual son the dangers that lay ahead. He spoke about the subtle corruptions that had destroyed previous kings, the gradual drift from dependence on God that seemed to accompany success and prosperity. But even as Jehoiada poured out his heart in warning and counsel, he could sense that something had already changed in the man he had raised. Joash listened respectfully, nodded at appropriate moments, and expressed gratitude for all that his mentor had done. Yet beneath the surface courtesy, the high priest detected a growing impatience, a subtle suggestion that these warnings were no longer necessary for a king who had proven himself capable of making wise decisions. The funeral of Jehoiada was unlike anything that had been seen in Judah for generations. The man who had preserved the royal line and guided the kingdom's restoration was honored not just as a priest, but as a savior of the nation. Kings from neighboring countries sent representatives to pay their respects, and the common people of Judah mourned as if they had lost a beloved father. Even more remarkably, Joash ordered that Jehoiada be buried in the royal cemetery among the kings of Judah, an honor never before given to someone outside the Davidic line. This funeral marked more than the end of a remarkable life. It represented the closing of an era, the final chapter of the restoration period that had begun with the discovery of the hidden prince in the temple chambers. For 39 years of Joash's 47-year reign, Jehoiada had been the spiritual compass that kept the kingdom oriented toward righteousness. Now that compass was gone, and the king would have to navigate the treacherous waters of absolute power without the guidance that had sustained him since childhood. The changes that followed were gradual at first, so subtle that many people didn't recognize them as warning signs. The king began to surround himself with a different type of advisor, men who were more concerned with telling him what he wanted to hear than with challenging him to maintain the high standards that had characterized his early reign. These new counselors were skilled politicians who understood the art of flattery and the psychology of power, and they recognized that the aging king was becoming susceptible to the kind of praise that his earlier mentors had carefully avoided. Where Jehoiada had consistently pointed Joash toward his dependence on God and his accountability to divine law, these new advisors emphasized his personal achievements and the wisdom of his independent decisions. They praised his military victories, celebrated his administrative skills, and subtly encouraged him to see himself as the architect of Judah's prosperity, rather than as the steward of God's blessings. The transformation was so gradual that even Joash himself didn't recognize how dramatically his perspective was shifting. The first major decision that revealed this change came when a delegation of princes from Judah approached the king with a request that would have been unthinkable during Jehoiada's lifetime. These men, representing some of the most influential families in the kingdom, asked for permission to reintroduce the worship of the Asherah poles and other pagan deities that had been completely eliminated during the early years of the restoration. Their argument was sophisticated and carefully crafted. They didn't present this as abandoning the worship of the Lord, but rather as embracing a more inclusive and tolerant approach to religion that would strengthen Judah's relationships with neighboring nations. They pointed out that many of their trading partners and potential allies were uncomfortable with Judah's strict monotheism and suggested that allowing some degree of religious diversity would be politically advantageous without compromising the kingdom's core spiritual commitments. The request caught Joash at a vulnerable moment. The success of his reign had made him confident in his ability to manage complex situations, and the flattery of his new advisors had convinced him that his wisdom was sufficient for any challenge. Instead of immediately rejecting the proposal, as Jehoiada would have counseled him to do, the king found himself considering the political and economic benefits that might come from a more flexible approach to religious practice. What Joash failed to recognize was that this wasn't really a question about foreign policy or economic strategy. It was a test of his fundamental allegiance, a moment when he would have to choose between the covenant faithfulness that had made his reign successful and the worldly wisdom that promised easier solutions to complex problems. The very fact that he was seriously considering the proposal revealed how far he had already drifted from the spiritual principles that had guided his youth. The decision he ultimately made sent shockwaves throughout the kingdom and marked the beginning of the end for the restoration that had seemed so secure. Instead of firmly rejecting the request, Joash granted permission for limited pagan worship, convincing himself that he could control the extent of this compromise and prevent it from undermining the nation's primary commitment to the Lord. It was exactly the kind of rationalization that had destroyed previous kings, the belief that spiritual principles could be negotiated and that partial obedience was sufficient to maintain God's blessing. The reaction from the faithful remnant in Judah was immediate and heartbroken. Priests who had risked their lives to preserve true worship during Athaliah's reign watched in horror as pagan altars were once again erected in the land they had fought to purify. Levites who had participated joyfully in the temple restoration now saw their work being undermined by the very king they had helped to crown. The people who had responded so enthusiastically to Joash's call for prayer and fasting during the military crisis now wondered if they had been deceived about his true character. But the most devastating response came from an unexpected source. Zechariah, the son of Jehoiada, had inherited his father's position as high priest and felt compelled to confront the king about his spiritual compromise. This young man had grown up alongside Joash, had witnessed the restoration from its earliest days, and understood better than anyone else the spiritual principles that were being abandoned. When Zechariah appeared before the king to deliver a prophetic message of warning and rebuke, the confrontation revealed just how completely Joash's character had changed. The man who had once sought spiritual counsel eagerly now bristled at correction from any source. The king who had publicly acknowledged his dependence on God now saw prophetic rebuke as personal attack. The ruler who had been raised to honor the priesthood now viewed religious leaders as obstacles to his political agenda. The prophet's message was direct and uncompromising. The Spirit of God had clothed Zechariah with boldness, and he declared that the king's compromise would bring disaster upon the kingdom. He reminded Joash of the blessings that had flowed from covenant faithfulness and warned that abandoning those principles would result in divine judgment. It was the same kind of message that previous prophets had delivered to wayward kings. But Zechariah delivered it with the authority of someone who had witnessed both the depths of spiritual darkness under Athaliah and the heights of blessing under righteous leadership. Joash's response to this confrontation was swift, brutal, and revealed the complete transformation of his character. Instead of receiving the rebuke with humility and repentance, as he would have done in his youth, the king flew into a rage. The man who owed his very life to Jehoiada's courage and faithfulness now ordered the execution of Jehoiada's son for the crime of speaking truth to power. It was a decision so shocking, so completely contrary to everything Joash had once represented, that it seemed impossible to believe. The execution was carried out in the court of the temple itself, the very place where Joash had been crowned and where Jehoiada had spent his life serving God. The symbolism was unmistakable and terrifying. The king who had been preserved by priestly courage was now spilling priestly blood. The ruler who had been restored through temple sanctuary was now defiling that same sanctuary with murder. The man who had once called the nation to repentance was now committing sins that exceeded even those of his grandmother Athaliah. As Zechariah died, his final words echoed through the temple courts with prophetic power that would haunt the kingdom for years to come. "May the Lord see this and call you to account," he declared. And those words carried the weight of divine judgment that no earthly power could prevent or deflect. The blood of the innocent prophet cried out from the ground just as Abel's blood had cried out centuries earlier, and heaven took note of the injustice that had been committed. The consequences of this act were swift and devastating. Within a year of Zechariah's murder, the Aramean army invaded Judah with a relatively small force, but achieved victories that defied all military logic. The kingdom that had been miraculously delivered from massive coalitions now found itself defenseless against a minor expedition. Cities that had been impregnable under righteous leadership fell with barely a struggle. The army that had been strengthened through years of prosperity melted away like snow in summer heat. But the military defeat was only the beginning of Joash's troubles. The king himself was severely wounded in battle, and as he lay recovering in his palace, the same courtiers who had flattered him during his years of success began to plot his downfall. The political alliances that had seemed so secure when based on mutual benefit crumbled when they were tested by adversity. The foreign advisors who had encouraged his spiritual compromise abandoned him when it became clear that his power was waning. The conspiracy that formed against Joash included some of his closest associates, men who had benefited greatly from his reign, but who now saw him as a liability rather than an asset. They were motivated partly by political calculation, but also by genuine horror at what the king had become. The murder of Zechariah had revealed a darkness in Joash's character that made even his supporters question whether he was fit to continue ruling. The assassination plot was carefully planned and ruthlessly executed. The conspirators waited until the king was weakened by his battle wounds and isolated from his most loyal guards. Then, in the darkness of night, they struck with the same cold efficiency that Athaliah had once used against the royal family. The man who had been preserved from one grandmother's murderous rage ultimately fell victim to the consequences of his own spiritual rebellion. Joash died in his bed, killed not by foreign enemies, but by his own servants. Men who had sworn oaths of loyalty, but who had been driven to betrayal by his abandonment of the principles that had once made him worthy of their service. His death was as ignoble as his life had become tragic, a stark contrast to the noble beginning that had seemed to promise so much for both king and kingdom. The biblical account of Joash's assassination is brutal in its brevity and devastating in its implications. The chronicler notes that he was not buried in the royal cemetery where Jehoiada had been laid to rest with such honor. Even in death, the king who had started as the hope of the restoration was denied the dignity that his early promise had seemed to guarantee. His reign, which had begun with such celebration and divine blessing, ended in violence, shame, and the recognition that potential unfulfilled is perhaps the greatest tragedy of all. The contrast between Joash's beginning and end serves as one of the most sobering examples in all of Scripture of how spiritual compromise can destroy even the most promising lives. The boy who had been hidden in the temple, surrounded by the faithful and taught the ways of righteousness, had grown into a man whose heart was so hardened that he could murder a prophet in cold blood. The king whose early decisions had brought miraculous deliverance and unprecedented prosperity had become so spiritually blind that he invited the very judgment he had once escaped through faith. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Joash's story is not what he became, but what he chose to abandon. He had experienced firsthand the reality of God's faithfulness, had seen miraculous deliverance in response to prayer, had witnessed the blessings that flow from covenant obedience. Yet despite this extraordinary spiritual heritage, he had allowed the subtle corruptions of power and prosperity to gradually erode his character until nothing remained of the faith that had once defined him. The kingdom that survived Joash's death was fundamentally different from the one he had inherited. The spiritual renewal that had marked the early decades of his reign had been replaced by moral confusion and religious syncretism. The military strength that had once seemed invincible had been revealed as hollow when divorced from divine blessing. The economic prosperity that had attracted admiration from neighboring nations had been squandered through political miscalculation and spiritual rebellion. Most tragically of all, the people of Judah had been forced to witness the destruction of their hope. The generation that had celebrated the restoration of David's throne had lived to see that throne occupied by a man whose character bore no resemblance to the shepherd king whose lineage he claimed. The nation that had been called to be a light to the surrounding peoples had instead become a cautionary tale about the dangers of abandoning the very. Have you ever wondered what drives a person to commit the unthinkable against their own blood, to murder innocent children, to slaughter an entire royal lineage, all in the ruthless pursuit of absolute power? Today, we're diving into one of the most chilling and horrifying stories in biblical history. A tale so dark, it will leave you questioning the very depths of human evil. This is the story of Queen Athaliah, a woman whose name has become synonymous with betrayal, bloodshed, and the darkest royal coup ever recorded. When her son, King Ahaziah, died, instead of mourning like any normal mother would, she did something so twisted, so unimaginably cruel, that it shook the very foundations of the kingdom of Judah. She ordered the systematic execution of every single member of the royal family, including her own grandchildren. But here's what makes this story even more incredible. Hidden within this massacre, protected by divine intervention and human courage, was one small child whose survival would change the course of history forever. This isn't just a story about political ambition gone wrong. This is a story about good versus evil, about how darkness can consume even those closest to the throne of David, and about how God's promises can survive even the most determined attempts to destroy them. If you're ready to uncover the shocking truth behind Queen Athaliah's bloodbath, the darkest royal coup in biblical history, then stay with me. Comment 777 if you're prepared to witness how far someone will go for power. And don't forget to subscribe, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about royal succession in ancient Israel. Trust me, this journey into darkness has twists that will leave you absolutely stunned. The seeds of Athaliah's evil were planted long before she ever set foot in Jerusalem. To understand the magnitude of her wickedness, we have to travel back to the northern kingdom of Israel, to the palace of King Ahab and his infamous wife Jezebel. This wasn't just any royal family. This was a dynasty steeped in idolatry, manipulation, and murder. Jezebel, whose name alone sends chills down the spine of anyone familiar with biblical history, was a Sidonian princess who brought with her the worship of Baal, a pagan god that demanded child sacrifice and sexual immorality. Under her influence, King Ahab abandoned the worship of the true God and led Israel into spiritual darkness deeper than anything they had ever experienced before. The prophets of the Lord were hunted down and killed. Altars to foreign gods were erected throughout the land, and the covenant that bound Israel to their Creator was trampled underfoot. But Jezebel's corruption didn't stop with her husband. She had children, and among them was a daughter named Athaliah. Can you imagine growing up in such a household? From her earliest days, Athaliah was immersed in a culture of violence, deception, and godlessness. She learned that power was everything, that human life was disposable, and that the ends always justified the means, no matter how brutal those means might be. When Athaliah came of age, a political marriage was arranged that would have consequences no one could have foreseen. King Jehoshaphat of Judah, despite being a godly man who sought to follow the Lord, made a decision that would haunt his lineage for generations. In an attempt